diverse systems more stable? And this has about at least 60 years of debate over it. And the initial assumption was that complex systems were more stable. And the argument for that was that if you look at like cropland, how much energy we have to put in to keep a system simple like that, right? And then also that when you have things like crops where you have a monoculture, your chance of a disease or a pest or something coming through and just wiping it all out, or an invader coming in and growing it over, are really high. Whereas if you go down to the tropics, oftentimes you won't have these, which are weather-wise are some of the most stable systems. They're also quite diverse, and you have less likelihood of insect outbreaks. That was actually, the problem with it is that if you look at it mathematically, and if you just make a matrix of interacting species mathematically, the bigger the system gets, the more likely it is to fall apart. And so there's a lot of controversy that this sort of generated a lot of controversy. The reality is that we have relatively stable systems. That is, if you go out to a river every year, you sort of see the same species there, right? I mean, there might be more or less, but on the other hand, you know, paddlefish have been in the Mississippi River for thousands and thousands of years, right? Tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years. And so from that point of view, those systems are pretty stable, even if their populations are kind of going up and down. So the question is, how do you explain the way that systems are stable, and the observation that if you look at something like tallgrass prairie, which has been here for about 10,000 years, even though it's getting flood and drought and all kinds of strange things happening to it, the species assemblage is roughly stable in this particular type of group of organisms. And one of the ideas is that, well, diverse systems, if you let everything interact with everything else, are more stable. Their real ecological systems are compartmentalized, right? And so we've already talked about that as far as food webs, that there's primary consumers and there's tertiary consumers and all that. And that's one way you can think of compartmentalizing food webs. Another way might be that organisms specialize on different types of food. So some organisms are herbivores and they just eat primary producers. Others are detritivores, they just eat detritus. Others, predators, might be very specialized on specific types of prey as opposed to just eating everything. So some fishes mainly eat insects, and some specialize on, eating crustaceans or something like that. And so this compartmentalizes food webs. And from that point of view, you have small stable systems that are linked together, and that stabilizes the systems as well. One of the big sort of problems that still lies in that is this idea of mutualism being important, because mutualism is not a stable interaction mathematically. That is, it's like a Ponzi scheme or something. And basically, everyone does better, keeps doing better, unless something else limits them. So it just causes instability in the system. And that it's still an area of controversy, but aquatic ecologists have been definitely involved in these particular discussions. The next thing to talk about is biodiversity related to ecosystem function. So this idea of diverse systems being more stable, also some people have suggested that diverse systems tend to more regularly produce the ecosystem goods and services that humanity needs. So this becomes an argument for maintaining biodiversity, because if you want to, we actually have gone through this in this class, so you get monetary benefit from the ecosystem goods and services that are provided by freshwater aquatic systems. Therefore, if that's going to fall apart and you knock down diversity, then you don't want to knock down diversity because you're going to get less back out of the system. So that argument's been used, and the initial place that this is one of the main sort of experimental systems that's been used by Dave Tillman up in Minnesota to look at this as grasslands. And Tillman's the same guy that actually came up with this resource ratio theory competition. We talked about this when we talked about the Monod equations and two nutrients and the ability for stable coexistence at intermediate ratios of silicon and phosphorus. But he's also got these grasslands where he's planted different numbers of species of grasses and shown that the overall system productivity is higher when you have a diverse system as opposed to a simple system. And this has gone and been tested with a variety of different terrestrial and aquatic systems. And the answer, so far at least, is that it depends. Sometimes more diverse systems do have a relationship to ecosystem function. And then the other part of that is that an ecosystem function that's desirable to us, right? So we don't necessarily, just because an ecosystem has a particular function, that may be a good thing or a bad thing. So eutrophic lakes have the ecosystem function of a lot of productivity and productivity of toxic cyanobacteria, right? It's a function, but it's not necessarily a function that's positive to us. So this is, again, something that remains in the literature and is sort of related to some of the stuff that I talked about at the beginning of this lecture. These experimental streams that Keith Giddo and I have been running out on Kanza, where we manipulate the diversity and see if that alters the ecosystem function. And we found in some cases it really does. And because what we're trying to do is recreate the things that happen in prairie streams. In these prairie streams, we have fairly simple fish assemblages. We have flood and drought. They get knocked out, and then they come back in and reassemble in different combinations, right? And those combinations can include fishes that eat insects off the surface, mainly the creek chubs, herbivores that eat the algae, detritivores. And what we've found is that if you have the right species in there, if you have the invertebrates in particular, they actually tend to stimulate productivity in the system because they take the nutrients from the invertebrates and they mineralize them back into the system and make them available to the primary producers. And so there's actually a relationship in these very simple biodiversity to ecosystem function. The question then becomes, is this a function of the traits of the organisms or diversity per se? I mean, is it specific to each system based on the traits and you know, is it a stream that has nutrients flowing through, or is it a lake that sort of has them all in one place? Are primary producers dominant long-lived, or are they short-lived that turn over real quickly? All these things might be sort of contingencies that alter your response. So again, it's not a question that's been answered necessarily, it's something to look out for. And then this question right here is actually an old question that probably doesn't have as much interest anymore, but the idea is still an interesting one, and it's related to bottom-up and top-down control, and the idea of what controls the length of food webs. And the idea is that we have some systems that have very simple food chains. Some systems have very simple food chains. So we think about a lake, right? And we might have primary producers, and then herbivores, zooplankton, and then fish that eat the zooplankton, and a big fish. So that'd be 4 levels. But you can go into some of these systems and have quite a few more trophic levels, and particularly the open water marine systems have, you know, they just have larger zooplankton, smaller zooplankton, bacterial-sized things, whole microbial loop, and then several levels of predators. So the top predators become, 4th, 5th, 6th level consumers, and we have very diverse systems. And so one of the arguments has been that what controls the diversity on Earth is the amount of energy influx to systems. And the reason for that is that if you look at the energetics of a food web, and we'll get into this more when we talk about ecosystems, we know that some energy is lost at every level, every trophic level as you move up, right? So if there's not enough energy at the bottom, it's not going to necessarily support a really long food chain. So that's a bottom-up control, right? The problem with this is that if you have really productive systems, they don't necessarily have longer food chains. And this is, in lakes at least, is for other reasons, because when we have a really eutrophic lake, the oxygen's swinging up and down, and you know, with all the algal biomass, if you have a cloudy day or at night, the oxygen go down below where fish can even make it. And so the big fish will just be out of the system altogether. You'll have almost no food chain length at all. So this one probably, the lengths of food chains are probably more determined by evolution than they are by production below. So back to your the E word, evolution, oftentimes explained. And you can imagine then you get these systems like the open marine waters, which are, you know, very complex and have evolved for longer than essentially any other ecosystem on Earth, because they've been in continuous existence ever since water basically formed on the planet. There's been oceans, and somehow they've been connected to each other. So that's these are all just sort of theoretical things that are of interest, maybe not so much of interest to management, although this one, diversity-related ecosystem function, has been used to argue management issues. That is, why should we preserve diversity? So we're going to talk now about dynamics in systems, succession, and disturbance. And the idea, so we kind of have two viewpoints of the world. One viewpoint is that everything's sort of stable. So I already sort of made that argument. You go back to the system next year and you see it, and roughly the same organisms are there. You go out to the prairie, the same grasses are there. You go sample the stream, the same invertebrates are there, right? So that's sort of an equilibrium view. It's all just kind of the same. But we know that there's these pushes on systems, continuous pushes on systems that change them. And then there's a seasonality. So there's this seasonal push on a system where the light goes down, the temperature goes down, the light goes back up, maybe discharge changes seasonally. So these can relate to seasonal patterns, and we can be related to disturbance. So that's what we're going to talk about in this section. This is Mount St. Helens here, and this is Spirit Lake. This is an example of essentially primary succession of a aquatic system. And so you can think of two general ways that succession can occur. One is that you can have succession that occurs on a completely blank slate, primary succession. So this could be, for example, an island, a volcanic island that comes up in the Pacific Ocean, or a stream that comes out after a glacier recedes. As you know, as the climate warms, our glaciers are all receding, and a whole bunch of new streams are essentially there that haven't been there for a long time. That's where you'd expect to see primary succession. In contrast, secondary succession might be after a flood, and it might be fairly common. So in Concord we have floods all the time. We have droughts. We have drought now, so we'd see it's not a completely clean slate. Maybe after a drought you'd consider a primary succession, because almost all the aquatic organisms are out of there. Right? A flood, you're just way down in numbers, so that might be secondary succession. So there's a gray area in there. In the case of Spirit Lake, Mount St. Helens, Spirit Lake was here. Mount St. Helens essentially blew out in this direction. And it was, the steam basically superheated the entire lake, sloshed it up on the far side away from the volcano, killed all the animals and plants in that lake because it basically passed or boiled it, and then filled it with a bunch of logs and debris from the forest that was up here. And there then was this primary succession that occurred after that. Immediately afterwards, first the bacteria came in and started breaking down all this organic material. And then slowly there were phytoplankton species that came in that had dispersal stages and were able to grow in there, and zooplankton came in there, probably on the feet of waterfowl, or else in the guts of waterfowl. And eventually there started to get to be some macrophytes in there. I don't think there's any big fish back in there yet. So that's a case of primary succession, and this happened, what, 30, 40 years ago now? So it's a long process. Spectacular example of primary succession. And then there's all the little new streams that formed in there too that Cliff Dahm and some of his colleagues have studied as well. So we'll talk about disturbance, succession, indirect interactions, and strong interactors. Responses of disturbance depend upon characteristics of disturbance and the organisms. That idea that some species are adapted to being in disturbed habitats and actually require it, others don't. The idea that many long-lived fish species require sort of consistent habitats, but if you can reproduce quickly, come into a habitat, and then disperse again, you may not be a great competitor, but you are able to keep hopping from habitat to habitat and take over. So disturbance can vary in a lot of different ways. It can vary in terms of intensity, how frequently it occurs, and areal extent. And part of the idea here is that the idea of pulse versus press disturbances. So you can have an acute event, a push on a system. So a flood would be an extreme event, right? Or the Spirit Lake being instantly steamed, right? That would be a big pulse of intensity. But you can imagine things that happen where many things that happen in all ecosystems that are more chronic effects. So when we have, for example, global climate change, it's mostly a press, right? Because the temperature's slowly ramping up over time. And the amount of precipitation annually is, on average, is changing slowly over time. So that's going to give a long press on a system, and it's going to push it from one area to another. You can still think of that as a disturbance, right? You can push it from one state to another. And if you talk about climate change, of course, the other big prediction is that the intensity and frequency is going to increase of events as well. So you have a higher probability of having a pulsed event as well as this chronic push that you have. And the last one's the aerial extent. So you could have a stream organism and you could have a bison walking through and turning over the rock, right? So for the algae on that, that's a disturbance. All of a sudden you're upside down, you're in the dark, you can't photosynthesize anymore, and that's a pretty big disturbance. But as far as the whole system, it's a very minor effect, right? That the whole algal population isn't going to be affected, so you need to think about that. That's one of the things that the research that Matt has been doing, and Josh to some degree, is the idea that these disturbances matter as far as network structure of streams matter as far as network structure, because if you put in one reservoir and you have fish that have eggs that need to stay in the water column before the larvae hatch, there can be a long stretch below that and a long stretch above that where there's enough to keep the populations in there. But if you put the reservoirs closer and closer together, if you have that disturbance in a smaller aerial extent, then it can fragment the system in such a way that the system doesn't operate properly anymore. So that would be a chronic disturbance that is of high enough aerial extent to mess up the connection of the environment. So these are the sort of key aspects of disturbance. And then we have how evolution responds to those aspects of disturbance. And this is the idea of R versus K selection, which perhaps is an overly simplistic view of the world, but nonetheless is useful to think about when you're teaching about this stuff. The idea that if you're going to be an organism that grows in disturbed habitats, you need to be able to grow quickly to take advantage of them because they're not going to be there for long. You need to be able to reproduce quickly to fill that habitat. And you need to be able to disperse into new habitats as they come about. Right. So that's the living fast and furious, hopping from disturbed habitat to disturbed habitat. Maybe you're the alga that lives on the rock that can get back to the top of the rock that was turned over, right? Or when we have these fishes that we see on ponds that we talked about, and there's this repeated flood and drought upstream, all these species are dispersing up and then reproducing pretty quickly for fish and to stay in there. And the first thing that comes in those streams are like midges that have very short lifespans. They can fly in as adults, lay their egg, reproduce very quickly, and repopulate the system. So those are what are called R-selected species. That is, they're basically selected based on the exponential growth phase of their life cycle. In contrast, you can have this idea where you have competition ability, right? And that if you have a good competition ability, then you're not going to be necessarily favored by disturbance, because you want things to be constant so you can compete well, and you're not, basically resources need to be limiting. So we can think of this idea of the paradox of the plankton, right? And go back to that idea. Why are there so many species out there? Well, it's because their species have different competitive abilities. And if you take a system and you really push it, like you dump a bunch of nutrients in it, and you have a eutrophic lake, all of a sudden one or two species does well, and the diversity disappears because you've only got the ones that just grow really fast and dominate in that particular situation. So another thing that organisms can have to deal with these disturbances, resistance. So you could have eggs that are resistant to disturbances, and we have examples of this, of diapause. We have zooplankton that produce a Phippia upon sexual reproduction. Their Phippia go down to the sediments and they incubate there until conditions get right for them to pop back out again. We have maybe some of the extreme examples are like the fairy shrimps, the tadpole shrimps, the large crustaceans that live in temporary pools, and their eggs can either be blown in or be carried in on the feet of waterfowl or moving animals. And their eggs can remain dry for many years, and then when you get rain in these temporary pools, they'll pop into existence and do quite well. It matters how far things are away, how far the habitat's away. So the streams, when they fill back up, they're continuous, right? And you can come all the way up the stream if you have to. If you have temporary pools that are out in the desert, they may form very far apart from each other. So you really have to be able to get a long distance to colonize those. There's other forms of resistance in addition to diapause. When we have the really big floods on Kanta, the fishes do pretty well for the most part. I mean, their population's knocked down, but they're mostly there. And the reason is they're really good at being mobile. So the water comes up and it's really ripping in the center and turning over rocks. They just swim out to the edges of the, where it's going out in the floodplain, and then as it comes back, they try to swim back in. Some of them get trapped out there, but they're able to move out of the bad stuff. But the invertebrates that don't have such good swimming abilities, and the algae, they just get scoured and taken out of the system or just hammered. So after that particular flood, what you have in that system, that particular system, is you've got a bunch of fish out there that don't have anything to eat. So the disturbance may propagate down over time to them. But think of some of the potential examples of disturbance, and I talked about streams already. What might be disturbances that you see in wetlands? The wetlands in western Kansas, for example, right now. Drought, right? I mean, if you really get dry conditions, it just. And lakes. Can you think of disturbances in lakes other than Spirit Lake, which got steam sterilized? I mean, maybe a drought if it was really severe enough to completely dry it, right? Pardon? Eutrophication, yeah, so that would be a disturbance of lakes. Basically, you think about lakes and you think of them as more stable as streams or wetlands, right? That they tend to be buffered against environmental change to a greater degree. So you can have a disturbance in lake, and many of those disturbances are driven by things like eutrophication, right? So what's a general cause of these types of disturbances? plants, or in general, just people, right? People do things that are extraordinarily destructive to the environment, whether we put a ton of sediment in through our activities, whether we put a toxin into the environment, whether we divert the water and take it away from the system. And so probably lakes have the largest amount of disturbance related to human activities, right? And then you can all sort of think of this sort of continuum between lakes, streams, and wetlands, with streams probably being among the most disturbed, and lakes being perhaps the least disturbed. However, if you think about streams, we can go back all the way to when we were talking about the hydrology of streams. Groundwater-fed streams are at extraordinarily stable temperatures and extraordinarily stable hydrologic parameters. So we have some of these up, like for example, in the Niobrara and the sandhills, where there's really no watershed per se. Everything just kind of percolates down in the sand and works its way back out. Very, very stable flow over long periods of time. So again, there's not this, it's sort of a generality of this gradient of disturbance, but it's not necessarily reality in every condition. So it depends. So this is an example of some work that Ken Fritz did on Kanza that puts some of these things together. And what he did is made an index of harshness that was based on how extreme the floods were, how long it had been since a flood, how extreme the period of drying was, how long it was, and how long it's been since that period of drying, and how far upstream the nearest source of permanent water is, because a lot of the colonization happens in streams when things are able to wash downstream. Now some things like invertebrates can swim up. So distance from water above and water below. When he did the analysis, the water below wasn't very important. He went out to streams throughout Kanza, from down the bottom where there's permanent flow, to spring-fed pools up high where there's also permanent flow, to the intermittent reaches in the middle where they're dry some of the year, all the way to dry most of the year. And he summed all these things and made this harshness index. And he found that the harsher the habitats were, the lower the diversity was from this. And this idea has been taken into the dry valley Antarctic streams with the algal communities there. And if I talked a little bit about the dry valleys, but essentially what you have is a system where there's not enough moisture coming into the system to make the Antarctic glaciers form on them. And during the summertime, around now, it warms up enough that the glaciers that are around the edges melt a little bit, and you can get water flowing down in through these streams. And what I talked about was the lakes that were down in there that are permanently ice covered, but a lot of the water comes from these streams that flow in for just a little bit during the summer, and at nighttime they'll stop, and then during the daytime they'll start up again as it gets warmer, and you have algal communities that form in these, and they did again a calculation of the harshness, how far they were from permanent water, how long they flowed during each day, how likely they were to flow, and looked at the diversity, and the diversity was higher in systems that weren't as harsh. So it's all based on a successional idea, disturbance view of the world. Yes?
So in elementary ecology courses, we're told about the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, and that we'd expect more of a parabola, a hump-shaped curve. And so has Fritz been challenged with this data, and have other people done similar things and found different relationships with their data?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see if I can, is that where I had it? Nope, I don't. I'll just talk about that right here. Yeah, so one of the ideas then is that if you have really high disturbance rates, so very harsh habitats, you have low diversity. And then in this system, we have maximum diversity at the lowest harshness. What Tanel's saying is if you had an even more stable system, would your diversity fall off again? And that's the idea of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And so what the theory suggests is that when you have a really intense disturbance, only those species that are adapted to being in there real fast, those R species, reproducing fast, have diaposing eggs, maybe colonize quickly, only those few species are able to get in there. When you have a really long, stable system, everybody's competing and only the very best competitors make it. So that's the system under which, when we talked about the paradox of the plankton, right, we had Harding's competitive exclusion principle, and the idea that if everything's well mixed and stable, that only the very best competitors are going to win in that system. And since not all organisms have the same competitive ability, you'll just have a few competitive dominants that take over. And given that, you'd say eventually you get to a situation where diversity decreases again. So what Tanel was asking is, why wasn't this a hump-shaped distribution, right, with maximum diversity in the middle and then falling off as the disturbance came lower and lower? That intermediate disturbance hypothesis has been proven to occur in some places, in many places, in many habitats, from lakes to rivers to little pots that are put out, and you let organisms just colonize them from the air. And the original place was in rocks in the intertidal zone, where the bigger rocks hardly ever roll, the little rocks roll too much. The problem with the hypothesis as a general law of the way things should happen is that we don't have any way a priori to say what is an intermediate level of disturbance. That is, it's difficult to scale disturbance against the biota of a particular area. Another way to think about that is that the kinds of things that happen to organisms in streams suggest that they have to be able to deal with things like floods as a regular course of events. But the assemblage of organisms that are living in the lake nearby never experience that. So from them, a disturbance might be something quite different than what the ones are in the stream. So we can't just come into a system and say there must be an area where there's a maximum diversity. In these streams, apparently, they're so harsh that there is no intermediate disturbance that gives you your maximum thing. The problem with that is that, so then you have an increase in disturbance with increase in diversity with disturbance, a decrease in diversity with disturbance, and then this hump, right? So you can always argue, well, I'm on the increasing part. When I see a decrease, if I see a decrease, then I'm on the, you know what I mean? You can always argue. So you can say, oh, well, the curve should go over this way, but then the next time you see the relationship this way in another habitat, you say, oh, well, the curve has to be over here. It means that you're trying to argue that, you're trying to argue something that you expect to be there that may not be there. It's a way of looking at it. So it's a pattern you need to look out for in systems when you're trying to maintain diversity, but it's not a rule. In general, when we talk about this from the point of view of managing diversity in natural ecosystems, if you set up the disturbance regime to mimic what the long-term historical disturbance regime was, your probability is the greatest of maintaining your native community, because that's what they've adapted to.